Okay, welcome back to ICE. What we're going to do in this video is to explore the web soup of technologies. What we find is that the web comprises a set of technologies, mainly because of the separation of concerns. Different technologies relate to a different concern in relation to building a website. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see that on the client side, there's a bunch of technologies that we have seen, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, for instance. And then in the previous days, now not so much use, but some websites still use it. You have a means to add Java code or snippets of Java code, not JavaScript, but Java code into web pages. And these were called Java applets in the past. There's also some websites use something called Flash. But nowadays, many of the Flash websites have been replaced by HTML5 websites using JavaScript. And here's a whole range of browsers. Of course, Safari and Chrome are two other examples of popular browsers. Over on the server side, we have a whole bunch of technologies here. And the key thing about the server-side technologies is that they are normally used to interact with the database management system. So for instance, if on the client side, a web page requires additional data, for example, Ajax needs to retrieve additional data, you can send a request using Ajax to a server-side program, for example, a PHP program, and PHP is a programming language, program written in PHP, which is then used to retrieve information from a database, for instance, an Oracle database or from a MySQL database system, and that information can then be sent back to the client. There's a whole bunch of web scripting languages. You can use HTML with PHP code, and we're going to see examples of how web pages can be created using a mix of HTML and PHP code. And if you want to embed PHP code into HTML pages, then you make use of this PHP tag. Right? Is this kind of tag. In older versions of PHP, we use this. Newer versions use this. And PHP code has a scripting flavor. If you're familiar with the programming language called Perl, it has that kind of flavor, but it's still different. You can also have HTML combined with JavaScript, as we have seen, and this is all totally on the client and browser side. HTML and PHP code runs on the server side only, and we'll look at what this means. And both are mini programming languages, PHP and JavaScript. They are full programming languages, and they are both interpreted, and we should see that they play different roles. And in fact, JavaScript is a programming language that can also be used on the server side. And there are some web servers that are written in the JavaScript language, so you don't have to learn PHP. Right? But in this subject, since PHP has been a very popular server-side language, and there are still websites that use PHP, we will use PHP as an example of a server-side technology. There are different uses. JavaScript is typically used for client-side processing for code that runs on a browser, but PHP is used for server-side processing for code that runs on the server side. So you find that with a website, some processing needs to appear on the client side, which is typically coded using JavaScript, and there's some processing that needs to happen on the server side, and that's coded typically using PHP. But of course, JavaScript and other tools can be used as well on the server side. Let's look at an example of PHP. By the way, PHP stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. So it's a kind of a strange acronym. It's a strange acronym because it's recursive, right? So the P keeps expanding. So PHP Hypertext Preprocessor, and this PHP here can be expanded into PHP Hypertext Preprocessor, and you keep on going. Right? It's just a fun thing about how they have named this programming language. For PHP programs to run on the server side, the web server needs to be extended with a PHP interpreter, and that's done for you already. On the Latrobe web servers, we have a PHP interpreter that has been installed with a web server, and all that runs on the server side. So when the client requests, instead of requesting a .html page, when the client requests a .php page, what will happen is that the web server will see that, aha, this is a request for a .php file, which is different from a .html file, right? The web server will behave differently. When the request is for a .php file, what the server first does is to look for that file. So suppose it's hello.php, it will look for hello.php in the appropriate directory, just like looking for any other HTML page. And after that, instead of serving that page as it is to the client host, it drags it through the PHP interpreter. So it sees that this is a .php extension. It doesn't just serve the contents directly to the client. What it does is that it subjects it or drags it through the PHP interpreter. It will then interpret any PHP code in the .php file, and then the result of that is sent back to the client. Okay, what does this mean? Let's look at an example. Right? So you have a file name .php is then interpreted by the PHP interpreter that's installed with the web server, and the output of the interpretation is then sent to the client. And the output is typically a web page that's generated by executing this PHP program. And the output is sent to the client. So the client never sees any PHP code. All the PHP code resides only on the server and is executed only on the server. So here's an example. The client requests for this file, server processing only .php, or whatever name it is just an example. And on the browser, for instance, the user types in this particular URL, which points to a .php file. Now, any file that contains PHP code must be in a file whose name has the extension .php. So in this particular URL, it requests for .php program or .php file. So that URL is sent, let's say it's a GET request, is sent to the server, and the server will then look for this particular file, and suppose it finds it. So it finds the file server processing only.php, and what it does is it drags it through the PHP interpreter. It executes whatever PHP code that is in that file using the PHP interpreter, generates the output, and the output is sent back to the client. So here's an example. Suppose in server processing only.php, it contains a mix of HTML code plus a bit of PHP code. And you can see here that the PHP code has been embedded using these special tags. So start PHP and end PHP. So it's this special symbol here. And what is inside this block is a bit of PHP code. And echo is like a print statement. So it says to print out this particular string, which is within that double quotes, and it ends with a semicolon. And this is another block of PHP code, again enclosed within those special start and end PHP tags. And sometimes this has PHP instead of just a question mark. Right? And then it echoes this or prints out this particular statement. Now, suppose the user types this URL into the browser. What does the browser do? So the browser will generate a GET request for this file, server processing only.php, send to the server will then look it up, and suppose the file contains that information, a mix of HTML and PHP code. What the server does is then take this file and execute it through the PHP interpreter. And we'll step through how that execution happens. So any of this PHP code will be executed and it will generate an output which is sent to the client. So let's look at this example to see what happens. Okay, so this is the output generated by executing this program using the PHP interpreter. So we could call this a program, although it's a mix of HTML and PHP code. Is effectively a program that is executed by the PHP interpreter, which then generates this output. So how is this output generated from this PHP file, from this PHP program? And remember, it is the output that's sent back to the client. How is this generated? Well, what the PHP interpreter that is installed with the web server does is that it looks at this code and it sees that this is like normal HTML. Right? So it just copies that out Then it goes to the next line, and this is just a normal HTML tag. It just copies that out. It sees that, and it just copies that out. In the fourth line, this is just text is copied out, and so on. So if it sees that all this is just normal HTML code, and what it does is that it just copies it out. Right? So remember, this is the output is being built here. Then it sees this body tag, this is normal HTML code, and then it's just copied out. And then this is just normal HTML stuff, which is then copied out to form this line here. And then what we see is a block of PHP code. So, and it says echo or to print out this particular statement. So executing this statement will result in echoing or printing out what is within these double quotes, which is 2 dot, this is PHP output with a BR, and this is what you see here as the generated output. And then it goes on to the next line, which is this. It says this is normal HTML, this is just copied out to generate this third line. And then it sees another block of PHP code. And what happens here is that it executes it. So the PHP interpreter will execute this, and it says to echo this string, which is just to print out 4 dot, this is PHP output, and this tag, right? Exactly as specified here. And this is how you get the fourth line, and then the next few lines are just normal HTML code. So that few lines are just copied out to generate the last part of the output. And this whole output, you notice that this is just a normal HTML page, is sent back to the client. So the client never sees any PHP code. The client just sees a normal HTML file. And what we'll see in the labs and other examples is that this code can do anything that you can program up in PHP. So you notice that here it is doing something pretty simple, just to echo this line. But you could, for example, have some statements here to query the database, for instance, a MySQL database, as we'll see later, and then get the results from the database, and then print that results out here. So, in other words, the output that is generated here can contain information retrieved from a MySQL or even an Oracle database. Right. So, it allows contents to be generated using information retrieved from a database dynamically in response to a client request. And we'll see examples of this later. So, the output is generated, some HTML page is then sent back together with header information to the client. And header information could contain location information, HTML code, and so on. Here's some example of header information. So this header information is used by the client for redirection. So if the location, for instance, that comes back is test.php, the client will then send another query to look for test.php, and so on. And we'll see this in action a bit later. This header information with the location attribute is used for redirection purposes. So before we go on to talk more about PHP, just to highlight an exceptional error, and sometimes this is kind of confusing. If you have a page like this, and if you're using this header function, which is used to generate header information, if you have a block of PHP code, like in this example, using the header, if you are using this header function, there must not be any HTML code, or in fact any string preceding the block of code that is using the header function, because the header function is supposed to be the first thing that is returned to the client, so there could not be anything up there. So if you have something like this, it will return an error, and you get this typical error. So this is just a warning, just in case you see this error, you know why, right? Because if you use the header PHP function in the block that contains the header function, there cannot be anything before that block. Now, this will also return an error. Well, it doesn't seem like there's anything before the block that contains the header function. Well, there's one space here. So this will still return an error. But this will be fine. Right? There will be no error in this case, because there's nothing preceding the block that contains the header PHP function. But we will see how this function is used in the future. Now, of course, since you can generate any output, you can also generate a HTML page that contains JavaScript. So instead of echoing a string which is just HTML, you can echo a string which contains some JavaScript code. Of course, it gets a bit confusing, but you can see that this is possible. And because you notice that these double quotes are located within this, right, this quote here is ended by this quote here. So you have quotes within quotes. So to escape these quotes, to avoid any confusion, you precede it by a backslash. So you notice that this double quote here has a backslash, and this also is a backslash, this one too, and this one too, to precede that.